Welcome to episode 101 of the Synergent Leadership Podcast. Have you ever thought about how to take your leadership to another level? And would you like a framework to do so? Well, my name is Julian and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Synergent Group, and today's episode we are going to answer those two questions. We're back for season 3 of our podcast, and our purpose for the podcast continues to be the same: to raise the standard of leadership. In today's show, I speak with Brad Giles, who is the founder of the strategic planning and coaching consultancy Evolution Partners. He is also the author of Made to Thrive, the 5 roles to evolve beyond your leadership comfort zone. Brad has more than 20 years' experience as a serial entrepreneur, strategic planner, and leadership coach. He has twice been recognised as a BRW Fast 100 founder and Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year finalist, and is actively involved in the Entrepreneurs Organisation. He is also a core advisor and trainer for Gravitas Impact Premium Coaches and provides content, mentoring and training for mid-market business coaches worldwide. Now, during the course of the conversation, we explore Brad's book in detail. I start off by asking Brad, why did he decide to write the book? We speak about the importance of accountability for both employees and suppliers. We explore the idea of the CEO being an ambassador for the organisation. And I finish the interview by asking Brad about the importance of strategy and succession planning. So keep listening. As always, would really love to hear what you think about the interview with Brad Giles, author of Made to Thrive, the 5 roles to evolve beyond your comfort zone. Happy listening.
Welcome to Season 3 of the Synergent Leadership Podcast with Julian Carl. Join Julian as he speaks with leaders and authors from Australia and around the world, giving you the opportunity to share in their journey and learn from their expertise and knowledge. Julian also shares some of the tools and techniques he uses as a leader, mentor and facilitator, helping you to build your leadership capability and improve your confidence as a leader.
Well, thank you, Brad, for being on the Synergent Leadership Podcast. Really appreciate you taking the time to be a part of it. So the listeners have a bit of an idea about who you are. Who is Brad Giles?
Well, thanks, Julian. It's great to be here. Who is Brad Giles? I build great companies. That's if I was to distill down what I've done in my life, what do I love doing? What am I enthralled by? It's building great companies. So that translates into normal English as to, I'm a leadership team coach. I work with leadership teams across Australia and also help others around the world in that capacity.
So we're here to talk about specifically your newest book, Made to Thrive, the 5 roles to evolve beyond your leadership comfort zone. Why did you decide to write the book?
What a great question. Thank you. I wrote this book because I didn't want a person to have to go through what I went through as an entrepreneur, as I built businesses. So I've started 6 companies over my career. I go back to a very specific time in the early 2000s when we were on the BRW Fast 100 list and we were growing rapidly. And I guess to translate that into another format, when I say I don't want people to go through what I went through, imagine a pyramid, and at the bottom of the pyramid is the worker. The next level up is the supervisor, the manager, and then at the very top is the CEO or entrepreneur. As people escalate up through that pyramid, what becomes the job? What is the job of the leader at the top? And so for me, I was always trying to find a book that specifically outlined in a simple, practical, and actionable format, what is the role of a leader in order to create great results? And what do I actually have to do? And, you know, I'm a pretty avid reader. I could never find that book. And so, yeah, I wrote it so that people didn't have to go through what I went through.
Well, I think you very much succeeded. I think the book is essentially for any senior leader. They can pick it up and they can read this one book, and then they've essentially got the way they can go about their leadership and management in one book. So I think you've really nailed that aspect of it.
Well, thank you. I guess it took me a couple of years to write, but it's really been 20 years of collated observations and experiences and testing and trialing with leadership teams that's taken it to that point. But to your point, yeah, I really wanted it to be something where someone was struggling, they could pick it up. They might not agree with every single thing, but overall, it's a simple handbook that a leader can read to sort of transition from being a good leader to being a great leader.
So I want to start with a bit of an excerpt if I can, and it's actually from page 1 where it says, "Start here. How to be effective."
Yeah.
That's every leader's problem. The question you're asking yourself, either consciously or unconsciously, is how can I make my potential count for the most in this world of effort? And this is absolutely the question you should be asking. But not in order to achieve fame for the sake of fame, nor to acquire money for the sake of money, but for the sake of usefulness in the world, for the sake of helping those you love, for the sake of benefiting society. I'm writing to those who strive and work, for I've given up on those who have given up. Whether you are the president of a kids' football club, the leader of a not-for-profit, a business owner, the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation, or anyone in between, this book is for you. And I want to help you become more effective and make your potential count for more. And this book began with a simple question. What is the difference between a good CEO and a great CEO? So what's the answer to that question, Brad?
Well, as a listener, what do you think? Because some people would say the difference between a good and a great leader might come down to net profit, might come down to shareholder value or EBITDA. But I don't think so. I think that's an initial and perhaps superficial answer. But what if we thought about that quite a lot deeper? You know, I think that you can get net profit and you can be wrecking the balance sheet. I think that you can get shareholder value and destroy the culture. So it's a bit more complex than that when we really genuinely think about what does great mean in terms of leadership. So I've, I guess, through my work and observation and this book, determined that there are 5 results that define the difference between a good leader and a great leader. Okay, and those results are a higher percentage of top performers, number 1. Number 2 is higher retention. Number 3 is higher productivity. Number 4 is consistent growth. And then number 5 is consistent results. So when we think about each one of those things, if we only had consistent results, but we had terrible retention, maybe we don't have a truly great leader. If we had consistent results, but we had terrible productivity, or we had no growth, or growth was backwards, maybe we wouldn't have a truly great leader. But when we look at what does it really mean in terms of making our effort as leaders count for the most, that's my proposal, is that higher percentage of top performers, higher retention, higher productivity, consistent growth, and consistent results is the answer.
So when you've spoken to organisations about those 5 results, well, what has been their feedback? Have they sort of said, "Yeah, that's how we'd like to measure it"? What do they think?
Yeah, I would say it's pretty much universal agreement, and it's universal agreement when it's explained. To be fair, not initially off the bat, but generally people say that makes sense. You can't be defined as a great leader if you're missing one of those things. And it's the depth behind it that matters. And I guess it speaks to a lot of the problems that we're faced with. You know what? We know what the role of a nurse is in society. We know what a great nurse looks like within reason. We know what a great electrician or a great doctor or a great baker, a lot of the traditional type trades, perhaps, we know what they look like. But what is a leader? How do we define a leader and what a leader looks like in greatness versus good? And so I think what I've found, I've spoken about it quite a bit now through the States, through the United States and through Australia. It seems to be resonating quite well.
Well, following on from the 5 results, you also talk about these 5 roles, which I think I'd just like you to run through quickly at a high level, because we are going to dig quite deep into different sections of each of the 5 roles. So what are the 5 roles that fall off the back of these 5 results?
Okay, absolutely. So I will just pretext this, if you will, with the 5 results come about from performing the roles. Okay, so the 5 results: high percentage of top performers, higher retention, higher productivity, consistent growth, consistent results, are coming about because a person is actually performing these 5 roles. And the 5 roles are: number 1, accountability. So there is accountability for all employees and suppliers. Number 2, ambassador. The CEO performs a strategic role as an ambassador. Number 3 is culture. A positive culture unites the team and attracts the right people. 4 is strategy. So the company's strategy delivers a unique and valuable position in the market that is different from competitors. And number 5 is succession planning, and that's key risks to the business are reduced through succession planning. There's a diagnostic that I've got within the book that really asks you questions about it. The book is effectively a large handbook or a large tool, for want of a better term. It's designed to be simple, practical, and actionable. My point is that each of the items within the book correlate to a measurement on the diagnostic, and that measurement tells you how you're performing on each of those 5 roles, and therefore how you would be performing on those results. And finally, where your opportunity is to become a better leader and transition towards great.
Yeah, and I think it's really useful the way the book's actually structured, because with each one of the 5 roles, there's essentially the 5 key points which people can, I suppose, diagnose themselves against, evaluate themselves against. And I'd imagine that, people are probably, when they do that, they're probably finding a couple of gaps in your checklist.
I mean, that's the basis of any improvement, isn't it? It's the delta. The opportunity lies within the delta. One of the key things in the book is this internet meme, which is where the magic happens. So imagine 2 circles that don't touch each other. The first circle on the left says your comfort zone, and then the second circle on the right says where the magic happens, and they're not touching for a reason. You need to get outside of your comfort zone to go out where the magic happens. And it's a bit of a silly internet meme, but it really does speak to what we're trying to achieve here by understanding the gaps, the things that you're not doing, which is really, as leaders, what we all want to do. We're able to then push toward that greatness.
And I think you also make a really useful point where in the section, how to actually use the book, you talk about the importance of that. Someone doesn't have to start at the first point. They need to start at the part which is most relevant for them, and then to focus on getting that one bit done, and then move on to some of the other 25 tools.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big fan of a simple concept, which is, this is best practice. How do we get best practice to work best in this organization, or whatever your organization is? My point there is that whilst this is highly prescriptive, how you do it is determined best by you. But I'd also add that the whole project has been planned so that you can reverse engineer it. And what I mean by that, for example, imagine if you have a problem with productivity. Okay, I don't want to get too complex, but if you have a problem with productivity, you can look at the 2 linking roles which feed productivity, which is strategy and culture, and then you can begin to know where to work in that area. Equally and opposite, for example, if you have a problem with having higher retention, so if you've got retention rate issues, as a leader, you can focus in on the ambassador role and the culture role, and there's 10 tools around each of those that you can work on to try to ultimately impact in a positive way your retention rate. So yeah, it's designed to start wherever you feel is the most appropriate, but equally and opposite, you can reverse engineer it. Finally, a quick word on that. If you've got no idea where to start, I'd go to Jim Collins, who said start with culture every time. So get the right people on the bus. That's how I would close that part.
Well, we're going to explore quite a few of these 25 points in your book, and because I think there's a lot of value in hearing your perspective on each of those. And I want to start with within the accountability role, this idea that we should all be making sure that we've got accountability in place for all employees and suppliers. So, can you talk a little bit about why that's such an important thing to do as a leader?
In my humble opinion, accountability is the greatest source of misery in the workplace. It's a pretty interesting and bold statement, but let me try to back that up. Where does misery in the workplace come from? Generally, it's because an employee's expectations are not the same as the employer's expectations. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that. Let's ask a hypothetical leader, what is your definition of success for employee A's role? Think about every single thing that defines success in that person's role, and then step into the employee's perspective and say, so what does success look like in your role? Those two things are going to have a huge mismatch, okay? So what we want to do is to ensure that there is accountability in that sense, but we can only create accountability if the employee understands the expectations of the leader's definition of success to the point that it's not possible to misunderstand. Now, that's of course across productivity and culture, the quantitative and the qualitative, but how well does a leader explain what they're trying to get an employee to do, what their definition of success in the employee's role is, to the point that it's not possible for them to misunderstand. So bridging that gap or reducing that delta is so important, because what that does is that reduces the misery. And by the misery occurs because the employee doesn't know what to do. It's as simple as that. The tool that we talk about there is capable, understand, want. So how capable is the employee of performing the role to the leader's definition of success? How well does the employee understand how to succeed in the role? And how much does the employee want to succeed in the role? So I'd speak specifically about understand, because that's completely within the leader's power or within the leader's influence. So once we establish that, and we've strongly established that the person understands, only then is it not hypocritical to actually hold the person accountable to the expectations of the role. So ensure that the person understands to the point where it's not possible for them to misunderstand the leader's definition of success. B, hold them accountable. Because if you don't hold them accountable, they think that you just don't care.
I was particularly interested in another one of the points you mentioned in the accountability role, and it's this idea that all employees report to their peers weekly on the two KPIs which define their role. And I thought this was interesting because for two reasons. One, because you're suggesting they report to their peers, and secondly, because you talk about the two KPIs. So in the work that we do, I think a lot of the leaders we come across would struggle to do this.
Why would they struggle to do that?
Because I think in our experience, number one, their peer relationships are probably not where they need to be. And secondly, I think a lot of leaders struggle with clearly articulating those KPIs. What are they really being held accountable to and accountable for? And it gets to your point just before. Do they actually understand what they're accountable for?
Yeah. So the overview in terms of context is there is nothing beyond great. Okay. And what I mean by that is all of this stuff is not easy. This is, you can't build a great company in one day. It's just not possible. This takes a long time. And there's a lot of challenging work, but the rewards are there. The original statement from the first page that you read out before is, how do you make your effort count for the most? So yeah, it's definitely not easy. People would definitely struggle with it. In terms of accountability, in terms of the original question, so all employees report to their peers weekly on 2 KPIs which define their role. So this comes from the work by Patrick Lencioni. Patrick Lencioni, most famous for the 5 dysfunctions of a team. Why is it more important to have people report to their peers? Now, this is 1.2 and not 1.0 or 1.1, because we want to obviously initially, or first off, ensure that people understand the expectations of the leader to the point that it's not possible to misunderstand, as I just said. But once we do that, if we can create an accountability of, an environment of peer accountability, it is so much more powerful compared to one where people are only accountable to the leader. It's certainly not easy, but certainly in the teams that I have worked with, we've tried for many years to do that, and you can't do it immediately, but little by little, you can get small wins here and there and do that. The go-to, as I've already said, is not me, it's Pat Lencioni. He wrote the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and that really illustrates why it's so important. Again, and that is because in an environment of peer accountability, it's a different conversation when your peers are saying to you, so you said you were going to make 100 and you made 70. What's your plan, number one, and what can we do to support you? You can imagine that's a very different culture and environment, but very conducive to a great environment and very conducive to a highly accountable environment.
And you mentioned about just then that it takes time and it takes work. How have you gone about distilling it down to 2 KPIs? Because quite often the organizations we work with, people have many more than 2 KPIs. And as a result, I don't think they actually deliver against most of them. But how have you found being able to dilute it down to these 2 KPIs which define their role?
What a great question. Okay, so I want you to imagine a Seek job advert for people who are outside of Australia, an online job board advert. And on there, this advert says, this is how great our company is, and this is the KPIs that you'll be accountable for. And it's got 10 or 15 KPIs. That's great. So which of those KPIs, if I fail on, will I be fired on? Will I be fired for if I fail? And which of those, if I succeed at, will I get a promotion for? You can't do every single thing. What really, really matters in this role? I think it's such a misnomer. It's such a fallacy in this world where we expect people to be measured against all of these KPIs, and that looks great in theory, but we know every single time when it comes into practice, it just doesn't work. So therefore, as a leader, a leader should be saying, well, what really matters in this role? The simplest role, of course, is sales. You need to produce a certain dollars of gross profit, for example, as a salesperson. Not every role is that easy, obviously, but we want to try to drill it down as much as possible to what really matters, because what really matters is where the person should focus their energy. People can't focus their energy in every single direction.
In the accountability section, you also write and suggest this idea that internal and external employees and suppliers who do not consistently perform are rapidly removed from the business.
Yeah. And what do you think about that, Julian? As a person who works with leadership people.
Turning into an interesting interview, Brad, turning the scales on the interviewer. I like it. My experience tells me that we don't remove poor performers quickly enough. If I think about my own experiences, leading, thinking of one experience in particular where I was leading a sales team, I would always be questioning myself and suggesting, I'll just give them one more month, because I'm sure they do it, because I'm essentially a nice guy and all that sort of stuff. So I think we don't in Australia actually do it as quick as we should. So I was pleased to see it in your book.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of reasons. So why do we even have the accountability section? I just want to take one step backwards. Okay. So there's a concept by a guy called Max Ringelmann. He developed in the 1890s, a long time ago, called social loafing. And what that really says is that every time you add a person to a group, you expect the performance of the group to remain the same. But in actual fact, every time you add a person to a group, the performance reduces by between 5 and 10%. So that means that if we had a group of 8 people, we're expecting, for example, the force exerted to be, according to Ringelmann's study, to be about 65%, but in actual fact, it's about 30% force exerted per person. Now that translates, it's been subsequently proven, into the animal world and to all sorts of human endeavors. The best way to put it is, if you were at a birthday party and you're going to sing happy birthday, one person's going to be yelling from the rafters, one person's going to be barely mouthing the words. Okay, so having established social loafing, let's come back to this. People are not all producing the same effort. Okay, step one. How do you build a great business? There is no other way than have great people. There is simply no other way. You've got to have great people to build a great business. Okay, so then we step on to the next point, and that's really interesting because I agree with you. People are reluctant to fire people. We have a legislative framework in Australia that is fair. I don't disagree with it. It's fair. We need to give people the opportunity to improve, but people don't take action when people are failing. Okay. Now, the easy answer to the question is, so you've got to take action because that means that you won't have people who aren't performing hanging around. But the kicker, the real problem, right, is that your top performers, the people who are putting in the most effort, the people who are producing the most results, are looking at you and they're saying, well, you know, you just don't care. I'm the one that's carrying the can here. I'm the one that's producing 3 times as much as that person over there. And you're not even holding them to account. You're not even talking to them. So there's 2 reasons. Clearly, if a person isn't performing, you need to take action. And from, in my experience, is clearly similar to yours, whereby you, as a leader, I waited much too long to take action and to fire people and to put people on performance management. But B, your inaction is costing you a lot more than you think, because the top performers are looking at you and they're taking 1 step towards the door every time you don't take action.
Yep, couldn't agree more on that one. Moving into the ambassador role, I thought this was interesting because you suggest that the CEO performs a strategic role as an ambassador. And I was thinking about the CEOs that I know, that I've worked with, that I observe. I don't know if a lot of them see themselves that way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there's been many interesting points through the book. This has definitely been one because it's got a highlight as one of the top 5 roles. So let's think about it for a second. So the word ambassador comes from the Latin word ambactus, which means servant. Okay, so this is ambassador in the context, or the context isn't lost here, for the original meaning of servant. But let's remember, originally, the one of the key primary concepts of the book is don't do other people's jobs, right? You've got to do your job as a leader, don't do other people's jobs. So in that context, you're not doing the person's job, you're acting as an ambassador. And people may not see themselves that way, but if they don't do the ambassador job, then who else will? The ambassador job is really important. The role to be the face of the company is really important, because you can't be the head of the company without being the face of the company. The irony is that many leaders expect their employees to be a positive ambassador for the company, and yet they don't do the same thing themselves.
Yeah, and I think to me it comes across quite clearly on my LinkedIn feed. If I review my LinkedIn feed, there's not a lot coming out from what I'd call industry leaders. There's a lot more coming out from smaller businesses, people trying to use the platform as a way to grow the business, which I do as well. But there's not a lot of industry leaders sharing their thoughts, views, opinions around leadership. And I thought that was particularly interesting because you also write the CEO has a system to build a public profile, such as industry forums, industry leadership, blogging, or speaking. I don't see a lot of industry leaders doing that of large organizations.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And yet, when you think to examples of people that do, the positive impact that comes from that. Now, this is not only to boost their ego. One of the foundational pieces in the ambassador section is that ego is the enemy. From Ryan Halliday, a book. Ego is the enemy of everything that you want and everything that you do. You think that the enemy, right? You think the enemy is your ex-wife or your ex-husband or your ex-business partner. No, the enemy is within, and it's your ego. Okay, so with that, this is not to boost your ego. This is an ambassadorial role that no one else but the leader or a department leader can do, and so it's a really, really important job. Okay, why is it important? Because business is all about trust. The data tells us that the trust in a business is directly correlated to the public's trust in the leader. So if you don't have a system to build trust, you will ultimately be negatively impacting the public or the customer's trust in the business, and therefore also negatively impacting the business.
I think it's a real gap, which I believe needs to be addressed, because you think about where the thought leadership is coming around leadership, and a lot of it's not necessarily coming from these leaders of these large organizations that are in the field, that are doing the day to day. And I think I almost get the sense that what you said is exactly right, that they don't think it's their role to do that. I think it's their role to be the CEO or be the GM or whatever their role definition is, but that doesn't seem to extend out to the public profile, the sharing the good news stories about what the business is doing, or their views on leadership.
Yeah, and to that point, I want to be really clear about what I said before, right? So this is about, or the question to be answered is, if this is best practice, how do we make best practice work best in this environment? So if you're not comfortable writing a blog, don't do it. If you're not comfortable doing public speaking, then don't do it. But there is still an ambassadorial role to be undertaken. It must be within the comfort of the leader, not necessarily the comfort zone. But it must be within the confines of your personality. But there is still an important ambassadorial role, because that's going to activate pride. That's going to activate trust. And that's really what we're trying to do through the ambassadorial roles, to activate pride and trust through employees, suppliers, customers, other stakeholders.
In the work that we do, I think a lot of organizations sometimes find it challenging when we talk about their organizational values, and importantly, how those values get embedded in an organization. So I really liked it when you wrote that all employees learn core values and core purpose stories monthly from the CEO, because I hadn't heard that approach before as a way of embedding the organizational values.
Well, remember, this is a part of the ambassador role. Okay, so it's an example of the ambassadorial role, and why stories. So there was a study done in 1969 where there were 10 words. I don't remember exactly what those 10 words were, but there were 10 words, and a group was asked to recall just the 10 words by repetition. And then second, those 10 words were embedded into a couple of sentences written as a story. And the difference between the two was 13%, 1-3, versus 93%, 9-3. So that is only a statistical example that is evidence that the human brain is hardwired to remember stories. Okay, so in the work that I do with clients, I actually ban acronyms. I simply won't let clients use acronyms, because it's not about the repetition. It's about the use of the core values in action that matters. That it's what the value means and stands for. And why the CEO in an ambassadorial role? Best practice is 5 to 7, according to Jim Collins, core values. Okay, so people respect what you inspect. So as a leader, if what you inspect or what you talk about a lot is core value stories, the 5 to 7 behavioral expectations or things that the leaders hold bone deep, well, that's really going to be what the most of the employees are going to pay attention to. Why? Because people respect what you inspect. So this is not something that needs to take a lot of time. But again, all employees learn core values and core purpose stories monthly from the CEO. Let's say half an hour per month, depending on the size of the organization. It could be in person or via video or whatever it is. It doesn't need to take a long time, but it does need to single out the best core values and core purpose stories, which is equally activating the pride of employees.
Talk about culture, which is the third of the roles. And you start off by talking about that a positive culture unites the team and attracts the right people. In your experience, have you found that organizations struggle to develop the culture, define the culture? Has it been more of a deliberate process, or has it become more organic? What's your experience has been around that?
Every company has a culture. Some companies don't accept that they have one, but we want to consciously build a culture. If you want your impact as a leader to have the highest, or if you want your effectiveness to count for the most, if you want to really make a positive impact and be a great leader, you have to consciously build a culture. I think that culture moves at glacial speed. Sometimes it moves a little bit faster. You can, let's say, fire 3 terrible or people who are completely misaligned or actively working against the culture and improve it. But yeah, it takes a long time to turn around and build a great culture, but the fish rots from the head down. So the leader must be the right role model for the culture. So in terms of being the right role model, what we're trying to do is to think that every single person in the business has a beginning and a middle and an end. They will start and they will leave. Every person. The job of the leader or the job of a leader in an organization is to cultivate people while you're their custodian. You're the custodian of that portion of their career. How can you make it positive and impactful? How can you make it really matter? And I use the word cultivate specifically because, again, the word cultivate is the original, that's where the word culture comes from. It's from the Latin word to cultivate.
And as part of that, you talk about the need for a qualitative and a quantitative system of feedback between all employees and leaders. I was particularly curious about this because I've come across so many different systems, models, views, perspectives on feedback that I was really interested to sort of hear where you believe best practice is in terms of the feedback. Yeah,
so have I. And some of them are so incredibly complex and expensive and large. I'm a big fan of how can it's easy to make something complex, but how can we make it simple? And when we make something simple, it's more likely to stick. So why do we need to have a qualitative and quantitative system of feedback? Now, this has been an interesting point. Okay, interesting point because the tool that's in this section, I've had several people come to me and say, look, I think there's a typo here. And I say, no, there's definitely not a typo. What we're saying here is that the employer, the manager, the leader needs to give feedback in a one-on-one situation to the employee, qualitative and quantitative, and equally in opposite, the employee needs to give qualitative and quantitative feedback to the leader or manager. Okay, that sounds hard. But let's go back to things like what we were talking about before with Pat Lencioni, where we've got accountability between peers rather than between leader and employee. We're trying to build an environment of trust. So why do we want to have this feedback loop, this two-way feedback loop between employee and employer or employee and leader, depending on the situation? A bit like a mini 360, you might call it. Well, there was a study that was done, HBR case study I think it's something like Why Employees Hate the Negative Feedback That You Love to Give. I've probably said it wrong. It was by Zegna Folkman, I think it is. And they identified that people are twice as likely to want negative feedback compared to positive feedback. Okay, I'm just going to say that again. People are twice as likely to want negative feedback than positive feedback. So negative feedback in the context of constructive feedback, how can I do my job better? So yeah, it was almost double. So people were half as likely, or it's on a scale of 10 to prefer, 10 to avoid, okay? So the lowest score is that people don't want to give negative feedback. That was like, I think it was like minus 2.3. And then in terms of receiving negative feedback, it was positive 4.7. So it's almost, it's almost 4 times the amount receive negative feedback compared to give negative feedback. No one wants to give negative feedback, but everyone wants to receive it. So what we need to do is to build a system where we can get employees and leaders into a simple 360 type environment with just the two of them, where they are forced to give negative feedback or constructive feedback. Tough conversation saying to my leader, how can my leader be a better leader? That's tough. That's a very difficult conversation, but it's one that we want to build, and we want to build trust based around that.
Well, it very much hinges on trust, doesn't it? Without that, there's no way known the employee is going to feel comfortable to be able to say, hey, boss, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm feeling.
I definitely agree. But this is not about building good. This is about building great. And it might take a year or 3 years to get to the point where we could implement this, for example. But this is really, it's an example of best practice, put it that way.
So you talk about the ideal employee and that their needs are identified, and the employee promise is helping to attract the best employees at the pay you offer. Are you able to dig a little bit into that for us?
I think everyone will agree that there is a war for talent. Okay. I'm going to go back to a statement I made before, which is you can't build a great company without great people. Okay. And what every employer in the mindset of recruiting wants is they want to get the best employees. They want to get, let's say, for example, the top 10% of available employees at the pay rate that you offer. That's the gold standard in terms of recruiting. So if we walk backwards from that, to use an analogy, if you want to find a needle in a haystack, the best way is with a dirty, great big magnet, okay? You can sift through, but you want to have a dirty, great magnet, something that will attract the best people. So if there is no substitute for having the best people and we want to build a magnet, what does that magnet look like? Well, that magnet looks like, in your organization, what does the ideal employee look like? So getting a really deep understanding of what that person looks like. And to that point, what I mean is, what is the needs of that employee? What does that person have an innate need for? And then building what's called employee promise around that. You may have heard the phrase brand promise. Well, this is the opposite of that. Brand promise is outside, the employee promise is inside. So what we want to do is to understand the needs of the employees and build a promise that we can stick to around that. And
you support that by suggesting that the employee promise KPIs are measured weekly, and I really like this bit, performance is displayed all around the business.
Yeah. Why do you like that bit?
I really like that bit for a couple of reasons. Mainly because I'm a typically quite a visual person, and at the start of this year, we had a merger with another small business, and the other small business that we merged with, they were very strong in lean and productivity improvement. And one of the things that their director has been very keen to explore with us is the idea of turning performance into something visual, which is literally on the walls of our office, where people can see it, where people can talk about it, where things aren't hidden. And it's something that I really want to try to look at for us as a business in 2020. And so when I read it here, I thought, no, we've got to talk about that.
Yeah. Trust. So a positive culture is built on trust. Okay. So stats from the book, 80% of employees trust their industry sector more than they trust their employer. Okay. And of the 20% who trust their employer more than their industry sector, it was only by a 3% average margin. That's from the Edelman Trust Barometer. So if we actually just think about that for a second. So employees want to trust their employer, okay, but we don't give them any reason to. So how do we build trust? We build trust with authentic data around what we're promising them. I would propose that you've probably seen a lot of examples where employers have made promises to employees that haven't eventuated. And every single time you do that, you're impacting your productivity in a negative way and you're impacting your retention in a negative way. Every single time you make a promise that you don't fulfill as a leader, again, you're negatively impacting productivity and retention. And so we want to, in the previous question, we want to understand our ideal employee and make them a promise that is unique and measurable and meets their need, that we will deliver on. And then B, we want to make those promises public. We want to announce or to make the KPIs around that public so that people know that we're fulfilling our promises and thereby building the trust in the organisation from an employee-employer perspective.
So I want to talk about strategy now. It's an area which I'm particularly interested in, and you suggest that a company's strategy needs to deliver a unique and valuable position in the marketplace which is different to the competitors. And when I speak to organizations about how they are different to their competitors, quite often it's very challenging for them.
Yeah. So why is it challenging?
So when I talk to these leaders, they, number one, quite often can not really articulate the strategy in itself. Quite often there's an assumption there that I think this is where we're going. If I think I know where we're going, I'm not quite sure why we're going there, but it's sort of been filtered down. So there's certainly a disconnect between fully appreciating what the strategy is and knowing how it's going to be executed. So that's probably the first part. And then when I start digging deep and talking about the points of difference between them and their competitors, again, it becomes, well, we do similar type stuff. So, we've got a slightly different pricing model, or we've got better people. And I don't think that's
believe
enough.
it.
Yeah, I don't think that's enough anymore.
No, it's not. What's the job of the leadership team? That's a fascinating question. I don't want to spend all day on this, right? But the job of the leadership team is to build and execute a strategy that increases shareholder value and profits. So, that in itself can only occur through differentiation. So, to your initial point, that statement comes from Michael Porter, arguably the number one thinker on strategy in the last century. And that is, a company's strategy delivers unique and valuable position in the market that is different from competitors. So that is the definition of strategy. Certainly in my world, the job of the leadership team is to discover how to be different across two axes. Firstly, what we do, and second, how we do it. So the more different that we can become on the axis of what we do and how we do it, the more different we are from the standard commoditized market. And that represents increased differentiation and therefore higher shareholder value, higher business value, higher profitability. So why does that problem occur? because the leadership team, when they come together, you know what they talk about? They talk about operations. They talk about, oh, we've got this project happening in the Hunter Valley, or this project happening in Queensland, or whatever it is. And they're only talking about operations, and they're not talking about strategy. So the whole of the strategy section is designed to say the CEO or the leader, depending on the organization or the position, the leader needs to own a system which is that of strategic thinking. And to the first point, quarterly and annually, the leadership team might meet offsite to reflect, evolve the company's strategy and set priorities. That's a really good part of it. So I don't know if you're familiar with Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Yes.
Yep. So he's got a time management matrix, and without visual, I'll quickly explain. There is an important axis and there's an urgent axis. So most leadership teams are spending themselves in what's called quadrant 1, which is important and urgent when they come together, operations, and instead they should be spending most of their time in important and not urgent, which is strategy. So that is designed around strategic thinking defined as the ultimate goal to deliver a unique and valuable position in the market that is different from competitors.
Yeah, it's interesting when we train, because we use Covey's matrix in some of our sessions, and it's really interesting that so much time is spent in that quadrant 1 and just nowhere near enough time in quadrant 2.
Yeah, absolutely. But that comes back to the original question. What's the job of the leader? They don't, the dirty little secret is that they don't know what to do. In my experience, I don't know what to do. I've come across a lot of leaders who they don't really know what it is. So they need to have a system where they're spending their time in quadrant 2. They need to do that. And they think, we're too busy. We haven't got time for that. But that goes back to Covey's story about the axe, where the person goes into the forest and they say, see a person who's exhausted chopping down a tree. And he says, so what are you doing? I'm chopping down a tree. Oh, so why don't you stop and sharpen the axe? And he says, I haven't got time to sharpen the axe. And he's been there all day, of course, with a blunt axe. But yeah, it's about spending time in quadrant 2. That's really what strategy is. And it's not going to produce instant results, but it's absolutely what leadership teams should be doing.
Mm. The final point I want to talk about in the strategy section was the idea that the ideal customer needs are identified and the brand promise is helping to attract the best customers in the market. It's interesting at the moment, I get a sense that a lot of organizations are feeling that the market is quite flat, regardless of which industry sector that they're in. And so I think there's a lot of focus on customer. So my question is around how do businesses really start to identify what these ideal customer needs are, and then how do they attract the customers to them? So
I'll push back a little bit there. And what I'll say is the market is flat for commoditized businesses whose leadership team spends their time in quadrant 1. When the leadership team comes together, they speak about operations. They don't talk about strategy. That's a fairly controversial statement, but I can take any pushback on the chin. So what's an example? Officeworks. Okay, so what do Officeworks sell? They sell pens and they sell paper and they sell some computers. This is all highly commoditized stuff. But if we were to analyze retail generally, we would say, oh, look, retail's doing it really, really tough. But Officeworks, as a simple example, most people on the call would know, they've carved out a unique and valuable position in the market. They've done a good job of that. They've worked hard on their strategy to get there. The challenge for commoditized businesses is, how do we step out of the day-to-day, understand our core customer, and begin to carve out that niche? That's the whole point of strategy. But every business can understand that if you try to be everything to everyone, you end up being nothing to no one. So who is the person that will pay the most for your product or service? Who is the person where you can add the greatest value? And that may be niching, but every business is different. But that's the job. That's the job to be done, is to understand where can we make a really big difference and pursuing that. So the the brand promise, as discussed, understanding the core customer, understanding their needs, it balances off against the ideal employee. So if you can imagine a teeter-totter or a seesaw, in the center is a company's core purpose. And then at one end, we've got the brand promise, which is the ideal customer and what we're promising the ideal customer. At the opposite end, we've got the ideal employee and what we're promising the ideal employee. Now, what we want to get is to have that balanced, okay? To have that teeter-totter, that seesaw flat. And what that means is that it's not weighing one way. And what I mean by that is by promising and delivering what the ideal employee needs, delivering that through fulfilling our core purpose, and then taking that through to the brand promise, which meets the core customer's needs. That's how we build a sustainable business.
So I'm curious about succession planning, and my curiosity comes from the perspective of, with the organizations that we work with, they will all say to me, when I ask the question about succession, they will all say to me pretty much without fail, yes, we need to do succession planning. And I ask them, have you done it? Do you have a process, anything like that? And they invariably say no. So it's almost as though they know the problem's there, but they don't know how to deal with the problem. Yeah. And you suggest that key risks to the business need to be reduced through succession planning. So can we talk about that?
So succession planning, let's just quickly define that for listeners. This is not about your family legacy. This is understanding the risks to the business and mitigating against those. And we'll clarify that a little bit further, but just to quickly isolate that. So in the work that I do with leadership teams, there's a question that I've been asking for, 10 years, okay? And that is, how many consecutive months have you exceeded your revenue and profit goals? And it's a really interesting time, because this is the time when the eyes look to the floor, people put their hand on their head and they kind of look away. And, it's not very often. Consistency is not very often. And when we look at the life day-to-day of an entrepreneur, let's say in the mid-market space or as in a growing business, it's a bit like a roller coaster. And what I mean by that is, 1 month we're making break even. Next month we're making a lot of profit. Then next month we're back to break even. Then we're losing money, and then we're back to sort of break even. So it's just going up and down and up and down. And the problem is that this is not really very good for your health, okay? And it's not good for your family, and it's not good for your wife or your husband. It's not a healthy place to be. So through succession planning, which to our earlier conversation is completely in quadrant 2, we want to try to build consistency in our growth and consistency in our results, okay? And that really, you think about it like an insurance policy, okay? So how can we mitigate the risks around people, products, services, suppliers? How can we mitigate all of those risks to try to ensure that we're not going to be upset, or they're not going to cause us to drop revenues or drop profit or impact GP or whatever it might be. So leaders are not really focused on that, but the problem of not doing that is having a huge impact.
I just still am amazed, I suppose, by how many large organisations just don't have, as you suggest, that each significant role in the organisation has a virtual bench of at least 2 people. I'm just not seeing it.
Let's define virtual bench. Virtual bench means that in a role, there, let's say sales manager, we have other people that we have identified who we could recruit if that sales manager left. Okay, so it's a virtual bench. These people, we are maybe in conversation with them over a long period of time. Maybe we've got a very basic relationship with them, but we know we've got that depth, because the problem is when when an organization has a person leave, what do? They go straight to the job board and they take whatever is available on the day. So we're trying to build an insurance policy really around that.
And what you also suggest, Brad, is that each leader needs to have a clear successor.
Yeah. Why a successor? So first of all, we said in the previous comment, we said that we want to have a virtual bench, which is people who are within the industry, outside of the organization, that we believe can step into not every role, but just key roles. Okay. Now we move to this question. Imagine for a moment that one of your key employees walks into your office and has got awesome news. They're just ecstatic. And they said, "You're not going to believe it. I've just won $7 million in the lottery. And my husband and I, we're catching a first class plane to Europe this afternoon. So today's my last day. I'm so excited." And how does that make you feel as a leader? And then you're kind of smiling. You say, "Well, that's great. But what do you do as soon as that person leaves?" You're on the phone to every single person that you could possibly find in a desperate scramble to try and get anyone to help out, because you know that it's you that's going to have to step into that role. So what we're really saying with this one, again, each leader in the business has appointed a clear successor who could replace them from within. We're not saying that that successor will step into that role. They won't get that job, okay? But they will step in a temporary basis. They're welcome to apply for the job, but they'll step in a temporary basis to try and take the work off the leader. It might be handling emails or handling work or whatever it is. But we're able to say, if this person in a key role leaves, that person will step in and help. But the funny thing is, having done that with leadership teams many times, what you're also doing is you're really identifying the high potentials in the organization. You're identifying the people who have the capability, according to the general consensus at that point in time, to step in. And that creates some really fascinating questions after that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting field, succession, and we always encourage them to, at least be thinking about it, but ideally have it all documented and having the conversations and so people know exactly where they stand.
Yeah. Again, my contention is that is the reason that it's worth effort is consistent results and consistent growth. That's the impact that succession planning has on an organization, consistency.
So are there any books or leaders or people that inspire you, Brad?
As having read the book, you will instantly be familiar. Jim Collins and the work that he's done through the years, the enormous research work that he's done heavily influences what I've done. So huge fan of Jim Collins and his work. Outside of that, I would say Ryan Holiday. Primarily, every leader I work with, I get them to read this book. It's called Ego is the Enemy. And I've already spoken about that earlier in this podcast. His second book that I'd ask leaders generally to read would be The Obstacle is the Way. So the first book, again, Ego is the Enemy, that's saying that the ego is the enemy of everything that you want and everything that you do and everything that you aspire to. The second book is really The Obstacle is the Way. It's saying that what's the obstacle in your life right now? What's the thing that's stopping you getting where you want to go? Well, that is the way forward. I don't really do it justice in any manner, but they would be the two books / the two leaders that I'd be going to.
And if people want to know more about you and the work that you do, where should we direct them?
So my website is evolutionpartners.com.au, and I'm active on LinkedIn as most people are. Really, my website is the first point. I regularly blog, like most people. I have a newsletter and so forth, but my website would be the first point of call.
So any last words on leadership and Made to Thrive?
I think it comes back to the beginning. Every person wants to make their effort count for the most. How do you make your effort count for the most? It's a really fascinating question. People don't want to be stuck in the mundane. People, People want to make their effort count for the most. I think in order to make your effort count for the most, you've got to understand the difference between good and great. You've got to spend more time in quadrant 2. I think that the job of a leader is not to do other people's jobs. It's to do your job and to do it really well.
Well, on that note, Brad, thank you so much for being on the Synergy Leadership Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Julian. It's been really enjoyable to chat and to dig into some of these topics. Thank you.
Well, that wraps up episode 101 of the Synergy Leadership Podcast, another awesome thought leader conversation for you to consider. This podcast is produced by my firm Synergy Group as a way to give back to the leadership community. So if you are interested in having a conversation with us, I encourage you to head on over to the Synergy Group website, tell us what you liked about the episode, tell us who you'd like us to interview, or tell us what sort of content you're actually interested in. And as always, if you are an iPhone user, please feel free, head on over to the Apple site and leave us a review. It really does help us build awareness of the show. In next week's episode, I speak with another thought leader, David Banger, who is the author of Digital is Everyone's Business, a guide to transition. So until then, love to hear what you think. Happy listening.